Welcome here today for the debated speaker that we have here today. We will proceed in English. So yeah, welcome. We have a very special speaker here today, Dr. Tom Palmer. He's one of the, at least for me, one of the most inspirational people in the classical liberal or libertarian movement. He's traveled around the world. It's what he does, I think, in his almost everyday life, travel around the world and speak about topics that regard liberty. This talk is going to be about the welfare state. Where does it come from? But it will also relate to the financial crisis and the debt crisis. So yeah, Dr. Palmer got his doctorate from the University of Oxford and is also active fellow of the Cato Institute, which is one of the main think tanks in the United States. Among many other positions that maybe take us to far, Dr. Palmer is also very active, being vice president in the Atlas at the Atlas Network. So we have a very, at least for me, a very inspirational speaker here today. Tom?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in one of the cities that could claim to be one of the birthplaces of liberty in the world. Because this part of the world was really important and significant in the development of civil society. Cities of the Netherlands and Belgium and all countries generally were really pioneers in religious freedom in civil society generally. What I want to talk about is an issue that we should be really focused on, in particular people in the generation represented in this room, because this is going to affect your future greatly, and that is the welfare state, and a real crisis of the welfare state around not only Europe but the world. Now this welfare state, we say in English, it's gone by many different names, different countries around the world. One of the things that's remarkable is it's almost everywhere now. It has become a very stable kind of political system. And the reason is it generates constituencies that provide it with support. One of the ways that I think we should think about the welfare state is in the context of political science, understanding it as a political system. Too much discussion of the welfare state has focused on only the alleged motivations of people who support it or oppose it, as though it's just about being benevolent or being not benevolent or greedy or stingy or what have you. That's not a very helpful way to understand a political system, to focus only on alleged motivations. Let's look at the constituencies and the incentives that it creates for people. What we're facing right now is a tragedy of the commons. If you know much about resource economics, you know this is a very serious problem in places where you have overuse of a limited resource. So the most common example today right now is fisheries. It is a very serious ecological and environmental problem around the world. Fish are captured at a rate faster than they can reproduce themselves. And the reason is, if I don't catch the fish, there won't be any fish there in the future for me. Somebody else is going to catch that fish. So go to places like Philippines, for example, where fishing is very important a means of providing protein for the population. They fish with dynamite. They go out into the coral reefs and they toss dynamite into the water. You could try that someday and see what happens. The fish are stunned and they float to the surface. You can catch them fairly easily. You can do this at a local swimming pool, for example, see what happens. Or they pour bleach, what you use to make clothes white, into the water. This asphyxiates the fish. They can't breathe, and so they also float to the surface. The problem is it kills the coral reef. This is a very serious issue. That's an animal. The coral is a kind of an animal, and it's being killed off. No coral reef, no more fish. Ask the fishermen, why do you do this? Do you not know this? They understand very well. They all answer the same way. If I don't catch them, someone else will catch them. And everyone faces this incentive. But we have a similar problem now with government benefits. If I don't get the government benefit, my taxes don't go down. Someone else will get it instead. If I don't qualify for a subsidy, if I'm a farmer, price supports, I'm a steel manufacturer, I'm an automobile producer, everybody wants a benefit. And it's all clear, If I don't qualify for it, someone else is going to get it. So we all have an incentive to, in effect, overuse this resource. The problem is, the current resource we're discussing is you. You're being overburdened because everybody wants a piece of what you're producing, and all of us have the same incentive. If you want to look at the historical origins of this institution, there's one man who really deserves central attention. Otto von Bismarck. It's one of his more snappy and attractive suits he liked to wear. The Iron Chancellor who unified the German states, not, as he said, in the liberal way. The liberals wanted petitions and votes and referenda. He did it with Eisen und Blut, right? Steel and blood was his principle. After defeating the Austrians, conquering Silesia, and then defeating France, he was able to unify the German state and engage in what today is called nation building or state building. This is what the United States is pursuing with such astonishing success in Afghanistan and Iraq and other countries. But he was rather more successful in this. And part of this was to create an identity between the German citizen and the state as such, the Second Reich, the Second Empire. This had many different forms, the German militarism that comes out of this, but a very important part was his strategy for creation of a welfare state, of a Sozialstaat in Germany. He was very clear that he wanted people to receive a pension from the state, to create loyalty to the state as such. He said, just as a soldier receives a pension for his service to the emperor, every worker shall receive a pension for his service to the state. The idea was you receive this as a beneficiary month by month. The German liberals who opposed him, his militarism, his colonialism, and his socialism, were Eugen Lechter, Ludwig Bamberger, and others. And they were very clear. They said this program will create of the German people helots. You know who were the helots? They were the slaves of the Spartans. So the worst, lowest class of slavery will make the Germans into helots, dependent on the state. But that was effectively Bismarck's actual strategy. He was very clear about that. We can distinguish a socialist state, sometimes people use the term socialism a bit loosely, in which the state seeks to plan society in a conscious subjection to some conscious plan. That's classical socialism. And along the way, the socialists argued we will realize a freedom higher than so-called liberal or so-called bourgeois freedom. Because man as a species being, as Marx describes him on the Jewish question, will be consciously planning his own future. It will be a true highest kind of freedom. It didn't work out so well, I think essentially because it's impossible. It would mean a world without surprises. Everything consciously planned in advance. This was a colossal failure. The welfare state is much more modest than that. It's the idea that the state doesn't attempt to plan all of society, predict the future 100 years from now. Instead, the state will relieve from your shoulders the burden of being responsible for your future in certain important areas. Healthcare, education, in some countries, housing, wide variety of different things. The state will now deliver welfare or well-being directly to the people. In contrast to the idea of a Rechtsstaat or a law-governed liberal state in which the state's responsibility is to secure justice and rights and people create their own welfare. This was put in the American Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness. Not happiness, but the pursuit of it was to be guaranteed by law. In effect, what this means is the state will produce happiness for you. It will directly deliver to you your well-being or welfare. Bismarck did refer to this as, it's hard to read here, socialism. He called it state socialism, but he didn't mean it in the same way that, say, Lenin means socialism. He meant state interventionism. And let's think about how welfare states are structured. And there are several features that are common around the world that deserve some attention to understand how it works. The first is called pay-go, pay as you go. This is a common feature of welfare state pension systems in which people pay taxes today, and those taxes finance the beneficiaries of people who receive money today. So the money is put in and spent. The idea being that you, all paying taxes at some point, will be paid for in your retirement by people who are not yet born. So they will pay taxes to pay for your retirement. Your taxes are paying for retirement of people now. And when you are retired, it will be the next generation will be paying in. That's pay as you go. Initially, these are very popular because the first people to receive paid nothing. They received the benefit, but they didn't pay it. And the numbers were very small. So this makes it a very attractive plan. It generates substantial political support. The problem is, in their mature phases, they generate unsustainability. And we're now definitely in the mature phase of welfare states around the world. In this little book, Pierluigi Falasca has a nice essay on how this happened in Italy. The 1950s, period of huge economic growth in Italy after the war. They swept away the fascist legislation, had a good 10 years of strong liberal government in Italy, a rapidly growing economy, and a very young population. Starting in the 1960s, they began to build a welfare state on the grounds, we're young, we're prospering, we're wealthy, we can afford it. Well, now they face the problem. They're not young, they're not prospering, and they cannot afford it. Initially, popular, but it faces big problems in the future. The second is called a fiscal illusion. We look at ways in which politicians can make the benefits visible and hide the costs. It's a common feature of fiscal systems around the world. Politicians like that. Look what I gave to you, but the cost is difficult to measure. And the most clear example of this is in pension systems. Bismarck was the one who pioneered this, and it's now copied around the world. A very intelligent plan. There's so-called employee contribution, which you're told you pay so much out of your taxes for your Social Security or pension benefits. Then, the employer contribution. You're told it's being paid by the employer, so you feel, wow, great, the boss is paying part of it. But any labor economist is going to tell you that's coming 100% out of the pocket of the employee. There's no employer contribution. It's 100% from the employee. If I hire you to paint my house, I say I'll give you 500 euros to come and paint my house. I don't really care if you spend the money on beer or donations to your church. It's of no interest to me. I'm willing to pay 500 euros. And similarly, whether some of it goes to tax or not doesn't matter to me. This is money that would have been paid in salary, but instead was taxed away by the state. Every year I receive from the American government a document saying, congratulations, you paid this much money into Social Security, and here's your projected benefit. But it's actually very misleading, because they only show half of what I paid in fact less than half. The so-called employee contribution. The employer contribution, which came from my pocket, does not appear on the statement. This is really grossly misleading. If a private firm did this, they'd be in prison. And finally, they're characterized as social rights. We're told these are your rights. You paid for it all your life, it's your right to receive it. This makes these systems very difficult to retrench or cut back, because he's been told this is a right, like the right to freedom of speech, worship, or the right to life. Now let's look at historical experience in the 20th century. The Weimar Republic, which succeeded the Second Reich in Germany and preceded the Third Reich, was considered the most advanced Sozialstaat or welfare state in the world. Very extensive welfare programs for the whole population built on the foundation created by Bismarck. It didn't turn out so well, partly because of the collapse of the welfare state itself. It generated a general social collapse, staggering unemployment because of the so-called employer contribution, reached as high as 27% in some occupations. And you could imagine the disincentive to work that this created and helped to perpetuate horrifying unemployment. But Hitler comes in with a National Socialist program. He says, we will create loyalty among all Germans, especially among our most humble or poorest citizens. We will make them loyal. We will do so by providing benefits to them. A very good book, I highly recommend, by Götz Ali, came out in German a few years ago and was quite stir, now available in English. Hitler's Volksstaat in German, Hitler's beneficiaries in English, is on the National Socialist welfare state. And he points out the fiscal crisis of the German state in the 1930s, staggering spending after the National Socialists came to power to solidify their support and power, and a fiscal crisis. So they said, where are we going to get the money? First group was the easy one for them to confiscate, the Jews. These were Volksfeinde, enemies of the people, and they confiscated Jewish wealth as Volksvermögen. So the national or people's treasury was confiscated from the Jews to finance this gigantic welfare state, and then the looting of Europe. This book is an exceptionally good book because Goethe is a very serious historian and a good fiscal and financial historian. He points out that when the German armies occupied the countries of Europe, they systematically stole and looted from them, bringing huge amounts of resources into the homeland, into the German Reich, where they had their political support and base. Ham, sausage, cheese, butter, taken from throughout Europe and sent back to loyal Volksgenossen, or ethnic comrades who were supporters of the National Socialist regime, and even the exportation of their inflation. This is one thing I found particularly interesting in the book, the way in which they forced the occupied countries to pay more than even the full cost of their own military occupation. German occupation soldiers were paid in Reichskreditkassen, RKK certificates that could not legally be exchanged in the Reich, in Germany, but could be exchanged at a fixed exchange rate with the local currency, Belgian franc, or zloty in Poland, or what have you, which meant it destroyed the currencies of these countries. Really quite an interesting study of how to export the cost of your militarist policy. Now this system was, in its less malignant form, so not as horrifying by any means, copied throughout Europe. Sherry Berman's very good book points out the common roots of welfare state policies, Bolshevism, National Socialism, and fascism, and what she calls the primacy of politics. That what is important is the relationship of the individual to the state as such, rather than civil society. And she looks at the social welfare policies throughout Europe through that lens. Quite important and interesting book. It was copied in the United States. The idea of a second Bill of Rights. If you know, the American Constitution has a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, right to freedom of worship and speech and so on, the right not to be tortured and the like. Now there was a new Bill of Rights which would include all kinds of state-delivered benefits to you. Let's take a very short digression into political theory. Think about what a right is. What the state says we guarantee your right. In the classical liberal tradition, rights are the foundation for voluntary social cooperation. I know what's yours, you know what's mine, we know the rules by which we can interact, now we can cooperate, rather than fighting over unclear resources. So that we're able to generate cooperation for mutual benefit. Try to pick an image, even dogs and cats can cooperate on occasion. And they do so by knowing what the rights and obligations of each are. In classical jurisprudence, we talk about two concepts of right. I think Flemish has the same language, German and English. The idea of right has an objective meaning, justice. What is the right thing to be done in the world? And then a subjective meaning. It is your right to do something. Sometimes you will find these confusing. It's the same word, recht, right, but we're using them in different senses. What's important in the liberal tradition was that they were coordinated. We generate justice by respecting rights of individuals. Even though we can't know what justice is, what is the most just outcome of the world, it's unpredictable. We can know what are the rights of individuals, what are the rules by which they can interact, and the outcome, if those rules are respected, will be just. Immanuel Kant presents a vision of that. The will of one person is reconciled with the will of another in accordance with the universal law of freedom. That was criticized very powerfully by people who said, no, there's a new concept of rights, social rights. And T.H. Marshall, very powerful theorist of the new concept of rights, argued that, okay, we have these rights from the liberals, civil rights, the rights of a person in a civil society, political rights, the right to participate in governance by voting or running for office, having parliament, and so on. Now we will give to you new rights, social rights, so you'll be richer, it's better. The theory being, if some rights are good, more rights must be better, like health or money or something like that. So you're better off now, we will give you new rights. And a whole range of new rights proliferated. Here from the American context, the right to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, the right to a job, and the right to sell your farm products at high prices. That's an interesting one. You have the right as a farmer to sell food at expensive high prices to consumers. The right to protection from old age and sickness, the right to a good education. This one has never been realized, at least not in the United States, and so on. Americans have lots of schooling, but maybe not so much education. The problem here is it breaks the connection between objective rights or justice and individual rights. Why? Because now we have these social rights that are going to be guaranteed by the state that may not be generated by our recognition of each other's rights in a civil society. Joseph Raz from Oxford University redefines rights in a very interesting way that has become significant for this tradition. The old theory of rights, the classical liberals normally advanced, is called the choice theory of rights. Identifies someone as a rights holder if that person has the power to waive or eliminate the obligation of another person. So for example, let's say I owe Arndt here 100 euros. We know I owe it to him because he's the only person in the room who can say, Tom, you don't have to pay me the 100 euros. That's what it means. He can waive or eliminate my obligation. He's the rights holder. Raz defines a rights holder in a very different way. He says a right is an interest of a person strong enough to hold another person under a duty. So if I have an interest in housing, which I clearly do, I hate living outside in the rain. I have an interest in housing. I have an interest in an education. I have an interest in food. I hate being hungry. It's terrible. If I have an interest in that, and the interest is strong enough for someone, called the state, to hold you under a duty, I have a right to it. Now we have a problem. Rights should not conflict, but interests do conflict all the time, in obvious ways. We live in a society without plural marriage. If two people are in love with the same third person, at least one of them will be disappointed. Maybe both, right? That happens too. But at least one of them will be disappointed. Their interests conflict. Interests conflict all the time in society. It's a normal feature of human life. But if interests conflict, we may have rights that conflict as well. And so conflicting rights have been recognized as a problem of this theory of justice. It generates conflict. I searched for the most brutal image of conflict I can find on the internet. You say, nature red in tooth and claw. Let's think then about a very well-known book, maybe known to you, by John Rawls. This is a very important book, and in my opinion, it is a great achievement. Rawls returned the discussion of justice to political thought. Prior to Rawls, most people were only concerned about analysis of meaning. And he said we should talk about how to live together. What is justice? I should also say, some of you have read it, it's the most boring book I have ever read in my life. Unbelievably dull. I read it 3 times from page 1 to page 9,000 or whatever, and finished it, and I had to overcome the desire to shoot myself. But it's important. And the reason it's boring is he tries to be clear and consistent. He repeats himself over and over and over and over. And he wants to argue for a theory of justice, which he calls the difference principle. You've probably heard of this, which is, it was actually a response to the extreme egalitarians who said no inequality should be allowed. Rawls said, well, wait a minute. We start with the idea of equality. Everyone gets the same amount of rights. But what if some inequality was to the advantage of everybody, including the worst off? Would you object? That's his argument. So he says those kinds of inequalities will be acceptable. But it has to fit a pattern. The whole social order has to correspond to that idea of justice, or social justice. Robert Nozick, one of his colleagues at Harvard University, wrote a book. I'm more sympathetic to the book, and I'll say it's more fun. This is just an objective statement. The other one is objectively boring. This is objectively fun. Because Nozick, he teases you, he plays, he raises questions and he doesn't answer them. Rawls cannot do that. If he raises the question, he must spend 100 pages to answer it. And Rawls and Nozick will raise the question and say, wow, this is an interesting puzzle. Let's move on. So it's a fun book. But it's also, he has one chapter, he responds to Rawls. The book is misinterpreted as his response to Rawls. It's actually a response to Murray Rothbard, above all. He wants to show why the state is justified. But in it, he did respond in one chapter to Rawls. So many people have read that one chapter, that one section of the book. And one of the objections he raises is for the state to realize this social justice, you will have to interfere continually with your decisions in your life. He gives an example of Will Chamberlain. Will Chamberlain was a very famous basketball player. And he was fantastic. He was a real artist in the game of basketball. So he said, let's say we all start with equal amount of money. We have 100 euros each, it's all equal. But we love seeing Will Chamberlain play basketball, so we'll pay 25 euro cents to watch him. Well, if you do that, depending on the population, he might end up with 25 million euros. Very rich. We all spent our money to watch him. We were better off. But the outcome is unfair. It's unjust. So the state will have to rearrange it. And he said that means our decisions will constantly be interfered with by the state, even though you presume that there was no unfairness. Now Rawls responded in one of his later books, many articles, and it's kind of interesting. As far as I can tell, he never mentioned Nozick by name, ever. Although he had the office just like 2 doors down from it. You can imagine how fun the faculty meetings must have been at Harvard University. He never mentions Nozick by name, but he's clearly really upset about this. He said, it's not true. Some people have said. And he says, not true. There are no unannounced and unpredictable interferences. Entitlements are earned and honored as the public system of rules declares. Nozick is wrong. That man is wrong. But then, in the same book, I read this very carefully, he admits exactly Nozick's point. Fair background justice may exist at one time and be gradually undermined, even though no one acts unfairly when their conduct is judged by the rules that apply to transactions. The tendency is for background justice to be eroded even when individuals act unfairly. Act fairly, pardon me. So even though all of you acted fairly, all of you followed the rules, the outcome will be unjust. This is exactly Nozick's point. And it was striking that Rawls admits it in the same book that he denies it. That acting fairly will not generate justice, so the state must come in and change and punish us or rearrange things to generate social fairness. That means you now have a system in which rights are not connected to justice. That's why they call it social justice. That's a clue. If it's social justice, it means it's not justice. It's a different concept. And it will not be generated by rights, it will be generated by something else, which they don't specify. We can call it power, more generally. Let's leave political theory, legal theory, go back to some financial economics. A pay-go system is financed as a pyramid system. It's also called a chain letter or a Ponzi scheme, after a very famous Italian banker, Mr. Ponzi. What it means is that the base of the pyramid has to get bigger to be able to pay the money upward. The way it's called, you invest in this system, and your job is to recruit other people. They put money as investment, and that's what pays you. So at the top of the pyramid, you're getting a lot of money coming. But for next generations to be paid, the base of the pyramid has to get wider and wider and wider. And that doesn't happen. It generates what we call fiscal imbalances. A fiscal imbalance represents the present value, and I'll explain why that's important. 100 euros next year has a value today. 100 euros 2 years from now has a value today, a little smaller. 100 euros 10 years from now has a value today, a little bit smaller still, because of the rate of interest. So the present value of an asset is equal to the sum of all of the future revenue discounted by the rate of interest. So any future revenue can be expressed in present value terms. A fiscal imbalance is the present value of the difference between what the state is going to receive in income taxes under current law and what it is obligated to pay under current law, the various benefits that current law prescribes. That difference is the fiscal imbalance. It's not the same as the total tax burden. It's in addition to the taxes that will be collected. And it's growing very, very rapidly. These are conservative estimates. They're being updated as we speak, but from a few years ago, over $80 trillion for the United States. So $80 trillion is a lot of money. It would take me years to earn that. Think about how much money that is. It's actually an unimaginable amount of money. People cannot distinguish when they do public opinion polls. They cannot imagine the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion. There's a really big difference between $80 trillion. For the European Union, over a 50-year time horizon, which is not that long, I hope all of you will live more than 50 more years. But the authorities only calculated over 50 years. It's a 53 trillion euro fiscal imbalance in present value terms. That's not money in the future, that's the present value of the future money. So in nominal terms like that, it's much bigger. But in present day terms, one way to think about it is that's the amount of money that would have to be taken and invested in real assets, earning interest, at a rate at least equal to what the governments pay on their debt, just to finance the imbalance. This is a really staggering amount of money. This data over European Union states shows the amount of money that would have to be taken from current GDP, that's not taxes, that's total GDP, and set aside just to fund the imbalance. So the highest 12.8%, 10.9% for Greece. This number is a bit old, it's now much larger for Greece. And so on. That's not taxes. Actually, for taxes, wage taxes, multiply that by an average of 2.5 times, is what taxes would have to go up. So another 25 to 30% wage tax increase in Greece just to pay the current imbalance. Now, it looks pretty grim. Estonia is the least worst off. Let's see if we can find Belgium on there. Only 6%. Now this number is old, so it's gotten worse. Every day this is not addressed, that number gets bigger. That's one thing to keep in mind. Every day it is not addressed, the number does get bigger. Now there are a few countries that have done better. Canada, for example. If you want an example, do not look to the United States. The United States government, under both Republicans and Democrats, is spending a lot of money. I would say they are spending money faster than a drunken sailor Friday night after getting his paycheck in port. I would say that, but I won't. It would be an insult to drunken sailors every night. This is actually much, much worse than even that. But Canada faced a crisis in the 1990s, and they began to address these questions and be adult about the issue. They've paid down total national debt from about $650 billion to about $412 billion in Canadian dollars. They really have addressed this in a serious way. They're not, as we say, out of the woods, but they are a much better example of responsible policy than the U.S. government. This happened under government of the left, quote unquote, initially. Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin who did this in Canada and was continued by conservative governments as well. Even NDP governments, which is the so-called Socialist Party in Canada, are much more responsible than the conservative governments of the United States or Western Europe, for a variety of reasons. It's not totally out of the woods. Their unfunded liabilities are still quite large. The unfunded liability just for public pensions is about 266 billion Canadian dollars. That's a fairly small country, 35 million people or so, compared to their neighbors to the south. So they still have a way to go, but they are in much better shape than Western European or US governments or Japan in this regard. We can look at what's been happening with their unfunded liabilities also, the red line there, looking at what is really obligated in the public pension system. So they do have a problem. I was just in Canada, and it's an issue that is being discussed there, what to do about these liabilities. But it's not just unfunded liabilities. There's something else. The most discussion publicly is about intra-generational, that is to say, within a generation transfers. So should we tax the rich more? Should we put taxes on the highest 1% or 2% or 5% earners? And so on. To transfer within a generation. The sums of money involved are much smaller than the intergenerational transfers that have received almost no attention. Intergenerational means transfers from one generation to another. And here's something that is shameful. Young people are being robbed. Just robbed. For the United States, Jagadish Gokhale, who's a world expert on these issues of generational transfers, estimates the current intergenerational transfer from young people to old people is at least $65 trillion. That's not how the world should work. You steal from the young to give to the old. When I say old, I don't mean 95-year-olds. I mean anybody 55 and older. And I think it's just shameful. It is grossly immoral what is happening right now. Because those young people are not being represented in the political process. That's why they're being robbed. 65-year-old people vote, and 7-year-old people don't. But those 7-year-olds are having their futures mortgaged in what I think is grossly unfair manner. Let me run out with a little bit more happy news for you. More countries face the Greek future than understand it. If you project the current trends for quite a few countries, take the U.S., within 10 years, the U.S. will be in a worse position in terms of its balance sheet than Greece, at the current rate of expenditure. And there's no sign that they're going to address this in any serious way. The so-called sequester is quite insignificant. In Washington, a huge cut is defined as follows. Today, we're spending $100 a day. Tomorrow, we could spend $200 a day, but we'll only spend $170. That's a $30 cut. So that's how they describe cuts in Washington, D.C. Huge cuts are diminution in the rate of increase. It's actually a diminution in the rate of increase. It's the second derivative that is being discussed, just to give you an idea of how trivial these so-called cuts are. The European conservatives are not well positioned to address this. In Greece, the Neo-Demokratia Party, the Greek Conservative Party, was a major contributor to the scandal, as the American Republican Party was as well. They added 100,000 of their cousins to the public payroll, and once you're on the public payroll, it's for life. You cannot fire a Greek civil servant. Even the old American standard, right? Being found in bed with a dead girl or a live boy, even that wouldn't apply to a Greek bureaucrat. You cannot fire them forever. And they raised government spending from 42% to 51% in 5 years of GDP. It was an orgy of spending. And here's what we get. We get riots, and we get the rise of this party, the Golden Dawn Party. Does that look familiar to anyone? To draw any images from the past? It's intended to. This is an openly National Socialist Nazi party in Greece. They attack and murder immigrants. You can go online and find films of them beating dark-skinned people in Greece and assaulting them, attempting to murder them. Why? Because they blame foreigners for their problems. rather than themselves. And it's happening also in other countries. Hungary, Jobbik party right now is in parliament, 45 members of parliament. They are now an openly Nazi party. Márton Györgyi in December gave a speech calling for a list of all the Jews in the country. Just imagine that. 1944, 1945, the Jews were virtually exterminated in that country. And here this man stands up, by the way, a highly educated man, multilingual, speaks English fluently, other languages, educated in Britain, and he calls for this kind of evil in the heart of Europe. It is a serious problem. Now, this system is unsustainable. And there's an old saying, if something cannot keep going on, don't worry, it won't. It cannot keep going on, but we should worry. Because what replaces it matters. And that's partly up to us. We should ask, what alternatives are there to the welfare state? It could turn out very ugly, or it might turn out well. And that's really up to you. Let me look at some options. One way to think about it is to say, before there was a welfare state, what did people do? It's not going to be perfect, maybe not ideal. But it might give us some insight into some institutions that might be superior. And I want to talk about some of those. The first, and here I cite a very good book by Deirdre McCloskey. It's a fabulous book in economic history, and I highly recommend this. She is a great economist, she's a fantastic historian, and she writes very well. We could do the Venn diagrams, and you could find there maybe 3 people who fit into the intersection. She's one of them, former editor of the Journal of Economic History. On the nature of economic growth, creating additional wealth. Angus Madison, the Danish statistician, prepared this chart, per capita income around the world from the year 1 up to almost the present time. I think this ends when he died, about 2008. And you see something pretty astonishing happen. Right around the year 1800, per capita income takes off in an amazing way. What made that possible? McCloskey and others have looked at this question. She calls it the great fact. What made possible the modern world? And she argues it was the unleashing of entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And we should ask, how can we accelerate that process today? But life isn't made up only of cash exchanges or economic exchanges. There are other ways we interact as well to provide social welfare. Many of you have seen this image, Raiffeisen Bank, all throughout Europe. It was originally a savings club for working class people to save their money. You came from your job, you put money on the pub, the bar top, and the pub keeper would put it in a box with your name to be deposited in the bank for you. Also, friendly societies. This is from the Independent Order of Oddfellows. These are ones common all over Europe, North America, and elsewhere. They're almost all gone, almost totally wiped out. At one time in the United States and Canada, roughly 1/3 of all adults were members of these associations. Now we only recognize them from some cultural remnants that they left behind. These may be recognizable to you. If you've ever seen the Flintstones, these are American cartoons from the 1950s and 60s. And I realized they'd become universal when I was in Bulgaria in 1988. In a rural village, a little boy ran across the green yelling, "Yabba dabba doo." I understood we lived in a global culture. What are they doing there? Does anyone know where they are? What we call that in English? It's called the lodge. They've gone to the lodge, this order of water buffalo, something like that. The lodge was where you went to be with your friends, but also to do things to take care of each other. They provided social solidarity. They built hospitals for children. They produced all kinds of social benefits. And if you were a member of a lodge and you had trouble, there were people who would help you financially and in other ways. They're almost totally wiped out now. In fact, when I ask American audiences, I say, how many of you have parents that go to the lodge? Typically, not one hand will go up. If you go to these lodges, young people, the youngest people there are 58. average age is in their 70s or 80s. They're dying. They're almost all gone. They had been all over the world. They created funeral benefits, all kinds of social benefits. They had interesting costumes, if you will, there. In Germany, they had the Schützenvereine. These are very important now. They're just a kind of a social club. But if you go to Düsseldorf, not very far from here, and you have the big parades, you know, Germans love parades. They have parades all the time, sometimes in the capitals of other countries. But they like in their own towns, they like having parades. It's a very German thing to do. And they have all these clubs. They have their floats and parades. The last one is mourners. Those are people who come to a funeral. They're dressed in black. They look like penguins, long tails. And they have a car. We call it in English a hearse. What we call it in Flemish, but for bringing the body of the dead person to the graveyard. And they walk very slowly at the end of the parade. That used to be a friendly society. Now it's just a social club. They guaranteed anyone in Düsseldorf who died and had no family or friends, and it happens, sometimes old people, the whole family dies, or a stranger who comes through town and would die there. This was before the internet, you couldn't send a tweet. They don't know where he's from, they would have a funeral. They guaranteed everyone would have a dignified funeral. And someone would come to be mourners. So there would be dignity in your death. Now it's just a drinking club. At one time they had a very important social function. They used all kinds of rituals, symbols, and uniforms to create solidarity, like this one here, African American Friendly Society, ridiculous huge hats. These probably wouldn't work so well today, because we are full of irony and we watch The Simpsons and so on, and we make fun of these things. But they may, nonetheless, have a role in our future in some different form. David Green, a British historian, a very good book, Reinventing Civil Society, The Rediscovery of Welfare Without Politics, which you can download the whole book. It's a short book. Google David Green and the title. He documented the growth of these in the United Kingdom. Astonishing, rapid growth. Really amazing, huge increase. Much bigger than trade unions, which get much more historical attention. These are much more advanced until 1911. First major act of the modern British welfare state, National Health Act, which did a very interesting thing. It was an assault on the friendly societies. You received medical care by being a member of a friendly society, which built medical institutes or hospitals. You could go to it as a right. You're members, not charities. Your right as a member to go and receive medical care, drugs, visits, and so on. The state now taxed you to provide you the same benefit. So now you pay a fee, so much per month, and a tax, so much per month. What do people do? Quite predictable. This one cannot be avoided. You have to pay it. This one, you stop paying. And membership begins to collapse. In 1948, they nationalized the healthcare system. And if you go to Britain, oh, the NHS is fabulous, except when you're sick, by the way, if you've ever lived in Britain as I did. It's fantastic, it's a great thing. Look at all the hospitals built by the NHS. That's not true. Go look at the cornerstone, you know, the cornerstone of the building, and see what's written there. They don't say National Health Service. They say Order of Odd Fellows, Manchester Unity Lodge, and so on. These are built by friendly societies. And the NHS has been closing them down in record numbers. But they did not build them. They were built by other institutions. What did we get with welfare status? Dependence rather than independence. As the German liberals, like Bamberger said, allow people to save for their own old age and own something. They will own the capital. They'll be independent people. Bismarck said, we don't want that. We want them dependent on the state pension. Received from the state, not from their own property. You get incoherent systems that generate fiscal imbalances that are now unsustainable. Civil society organizations are displaced, and in some cases, dramatic social fragmentation. I talk about some cases in this book. Now you might think, why can't they have friendly societies anymore? That's the past. That's the Flintstones. That's people like our great-great-grandparents. They're uncool. No one will do that today. But that's not true. There are friendly societies that still persist. They're just invisible to most people. And this is one I like a lot. Alcoholics Anonymous. So any of you have ever had experience with a family member or a friend or someone you know who has very severe alcohol dependency? You'll learn something. I'll tell you right now if you don't know it. Your best friend or brother or sister or aunt or uncle or parent or someone is alcoholic and you're not, let me explain something to you. You can't help them. I know